Hey guys, Mr. Ham here, talk to you about the Blitzkrieg and where would Hitler go next. So if you're looking at your hyperdoc, this is going to be on on slides 3 and 4. So the first slide will be Hitler and the Blitzkrieg, and then the next slide will be where would Hitler go next. And I'll let you know when I make that transition. After you listen to this, go ahead and click through some of the links on those slides because some of the questions you're going to have a little bit of extra information than what I'm going to go over with this. But let's go ahead and get started with the Blitzkrieg and where would Hitler go next, because this is pretty important definitions and everything like that, so you kind of understand what was happening in World War II. So first of all, what is Blitzkrieg? Well, Blitzkrieg is a term for warfare, and it literally means lightning war in German. And you'll see what I mean, why this is such a good term for a Blitzkrieg once we get started talking about some of this stuff. So this is a new form of warfare. Remember, World War I was a huge innovation in warfare. Things like trench warfare, tanks, artillery, airplanes, all this kind of stuff was coming about during World War I. But since World War I, warfare hasn't really changed a whole lot because there really hasn't been big-time wars. That's when a lot of innovation happens, is when wars come around, just like with World War I. Well, Blitzkrieg is kind of that next evolution of that warfare. So we'll talk about what it means exactly. But just the overview is basically it uses the element of surprise to defeat these fortified positions. Remember, a big part of World War I trench warfare was having these huge fortified trenches that were almost impossible to get through. And this is a way to kind of get around that and defeat that. So if we look at trench warfare, kind of a review for you, this is what it looks like usually. You'd have two trenches lined up against each other, sometimes, only a few hundred yards apart from each other, and there'd be armies in these trenches. They'd be supported by artillery, and it would be like this for a huge amount of time. And so these armies would be lined up across from each other. They'd be dug in, and it would be very slow and very kind of grind through each other, and that was the goal of this. And so both these sides were going to be supported by artillery and Air Force, so they would soften them up with artillery and Air Force, and then, they'd run out of the trenches and try and take the enemy trench. And if it was successful, even, you might only get a few hundred yards worth of space over several months. And that's how the war went. Remember, World War I, the front line didn't move a whole lot until really, really late in the war. And these lines would stretch for miles. Remember, almost the entire northern border of France was covered in these trench lines that were opposing one another. So what is Blitzkrieg? Well, if we take these armies and we look at this, Blitzkrieg changes it. And what Hitler's army did, if we have the Nazis and Germany over here on the left, and let's say Poland or France on the right, what they would do is Poland would have their setup here of the typical army. So you'd have your army in the trenches, you'd have artillery back there behind them, kind of ready to take whatever's going to come at you. Well, Hitler and the Germans, they change up what is going to happen here. And what they do is they focus on these edges here. They focus on this army here and this army here. And what they're going to do is ignore this middle here. And so what they do is they take huge amounts of their army and they support it by Air Force, and they will bomb them. They will use the artillery and attack them. And then the army will sweep in and push them all the way back. And this would happen on both ends. You'd have the Air Force here, the artillery attacking them. And basically, it would overwhelm these armies. And so now what you have is you have these German armies have surrounded the middle part here, and they basically can pinch in from behind and surround them. And this would happen quick. So this would happen in a matter of hours sometimes. And you could overwhelm this, what was previously a nearly impenetrable line, by focusing on weak points and then taking over the middle here and then surrounding them and either forcing them to surrender or destroying them. So that's the Blitzkrieg. It was quick. It was lightning quick on this. And Hitler would use this in his invasion of Poland. So Poland is the eastern border, and I'll show you a map here. He used some of the aspects of Blitzkrieg, but not all of them. He kind of kept some cards to himself. He kept his hand close to his pocket, so he would use a lot of these aspects, but not all of them. We'll talk about why that was here in a minute. But this invasion began on September 1st. This is the country of Poland. And again, we'll look at a map of this. September 1st, 1939, and the fighting was finished almost a month. This is when they officially annexed Poland, was this October 8th. So from September 1st to October 8th, about a month span, the entire country of Poland was taken over. So think in terms of World War I, that is so fast how quickly they took over this country. It helped also that the Soviets had invaded eastern Poland on September 17th. So kind of right in the middle of this, the Poles kind of faced both sides of this. So if we look at a map here, you can see how the Russians over here on the right were using very typical tactics, just kind of pushing up along. But the Germans, you can see they were surrounding, and they'd cut off this group. They would surround and cut off this group, surround, cut them off, cut them off, cut them off. And they would eventually defeat the entire Polish force using that Blitzkrieg tactic. Okay, so that's the end of slide 3. Now we're on to slide 4. So the question becomes, what would Hitler do next? Because this was on display. It wasn't a secret that he invaded Poland. He had annexed Czechoslovakia, places like Austria and stuff like that. But then he invades Poland in this, lightning quick, violent way and takes over the entire country of Poland, which was established, following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. And so this is a very blatant act of war, very blatant going in the face of what was happening with the Treaty of Versailles and everything. So in response, 2 days later, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. So remember, September 1st, he invades Poland. Well, 2 days later, France and Germany declare war. So it's lightning quick, they declare war. Well, what happens next is a big, big part of World War II, because what happens next is nothing. For 8 months, there is no conflict. They call it the Blitzkrieg. France and Britain, even though they had declared war, they sat back and they did not attack the Germans. They didn't send support to the Poles or anything like that. Meanwhile, so this was known as the Blitzkrieg. So it's kind of a jab at the Blitzkrieg tactics that Hitler was using. And so you have this border between France and Germany right here. It's called the Maginot Line. And what the Maginot Line is basically this impenetrable wall of forts and armies and artillery and stuff like that. And it was designed basically to prevent anyone from penetrating it. So basically the idea here was, we are going to put our strongest forces here. We saw what his tactics are, and now we're going to try and wait him out and be defensive on this. Well, Germany wasn't waiting. They were consolidating power, and they were annexing places like Poland. They were creating new weapons. They were refining what they were doing, and they were creating plans at this time. So while the Allies were waiting for 8 months, which in this war is a huge period of time, they were doing nothing while the Germans were basically preparing for the next move. And we'll talk about the next move on slides 5 and 6. But the French and the British, they knew that the Germans, they might do exactly what they did in World War I, and they might just come through Belgium here in the north and invade France. So they actually had a plan. And the plan was, if they do this, or when they do this, we're going to counterattack with everything we've got. We're going to push them back, and we're going to invade back into Germany. And we'll talk about what happens with that on the next few slides. But for now, go ahead and answer slides 3